Thanks to our session partners, Helen Hamden, Centre for Design, and also to Dave Clements, who's sitting on my far right, who's the producer of this session from the Social Policy Forum. In case you've left your brochure somewhere else, you can't check, you're in the session which is concerned about the role of charities today. My name's Sheila. I've been involved with charities in one way or another throughout my career, which is quite long. And that was before I became part of the dreaded profession, the much maligned profession of consultant. I've actually been doing it for 25 years, which I think is longer than many people. And as well as currently working as a consultant, I'm actually a board member of East Thames Homes, which is a housing association and a charity in East London. This is a very good time, I think, to be talking about charities. I just read yesterday that the number of people employed in the voluntary and charity sector has grown by 40% in the last 10 years. So clearly it is a growing sector. And even before Cameron's big society put the spotlight on community and voluntary groups, the previous government was also courting groups, partly as a way of rebuilding community, but for other purposes too. But now the focus is very much on voluntary community groups, but also at a time when public sector cuts have affected a vast majority of them. So there are lots of stories of charities having to find 25 to 30% cuts in contracts that they've got with local authorities or central government and provide the same level of service as they have previously done. So this actually begs the question, should charities be involved with providing those sorts of services anyway? Should they actually just be campaigning organisations? Should they be completely independent of the state? Or is it that there are other reasons for charities to be involved with the state? These are just a few of the questions I think we're going to talk about today. Hopefully there'll be some more formal questions. It's only an hour, so I'm going to try and keep the speakers to time. They're going to speak for just a maximum of 5 minutes each, less if they can fit it in. So to introduce them, firstly, on my immediate right is Simon Blake, who's the Chief Executive of Brook, the young people's sexual health charity. He's also negotiating with government on behalf of voluntary and community organisations, and has been awarded an OBE for his services to the voluntary sector and his work with young people. He's written books on sex and relationship education and is passionate about young people's right to information and support on sexual health, and he wants to see a change in the culture and attitude to that. The next person to speak will be Dave Clements. He's on my far right. He's one of the producers of the Society Wars Strand and the Battle of Ideas this year. He's also author of The Future of Community Reports of a Death Greatly Exaggerated, and he writes for Spikes, The Guardian, blogs for Huffington Post. I think he works as well, does a lot of this. And as a convener of the IoI Social Policy Forum. On my left is Ed West. He's a journalist and social commentator, and he's a features writer for the Daily Telegraph and features editor for the Catholic Herald. He's written on a lot of different topics, as diverse as Britain in Europe, Dale Farm, immigration, and of course, quite recently on the YWCA, now known as Platform 51. So, Simon, over to you first.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to draw a bit on my experience working both within the charity sector and as a civil servant for a brief time to try and describe to you what I think some of the issues are, but I'm hoping that just in describing my experience and some of the learning from that, you'll ask the questions which will drive us to some of the answers. As I said, I'm the Chief Executive of Brook, the young people's sexual health charity, which was set up in 1964. I chair Compact Voice, which represents the voluntary and community sector in relations with government and negotiates with government to establish a compact which sets out the rules of the game, if you like. And I also volunteer for a small charity which takes absolutely no money from the state to help disadvantaged children to ride. And I want to just draw a little bit on each of those three ride horses. I'm sorry, for those of you who riding doesn't automatically set that image. And what I want to do is nail my salesman mask at the outset, really, and not leave you waiting until the end of the 5 minutes to know whether I think charities are in crisis or not. Yes, it's a pivotal time for charities. Yes, it's a difficult time for many charities, as it's a difficult time for many in the public sector and many people also working in private business as well. I think it's true to say that some will survive, and not all of the charities and community groups that exist will survive. And for some people and for some of those organisations it will be sad. And for some it will also be right that they don't survive. Either their job is done or they're not doing their job well enough in order to actually warrant the support of individuals, the state or grants, however they're funded. What I think the question we're asking is, if we put it simply, is has the charity sector become too reliant on state funding and delivery of state objectives, and in doing so lost its way as a campaigner and seeker of social justice? And I think that there is no way that we can say that charities can be completely independent. It would mean that some of the very, very good delivery which happens in partnership with government and independently of government would actually disappear, and therefore some of the beneficiaries of that would not actually get the benefit. So Brook was established in 1964 as an organisation to provide contraception for unmarried women. It was a time when nobody else would. It was before the 1967 Abortion Act, and it was before the NHS provided contraception. So just to put that in context for you, it's set up working against the grain when the rules said this isn't something that you do. And over the last 47 years, has increasingly become part of the mainstream, in that it's campaigned to seek and to realise some of the rights which young people have in relation to their sexual health, and as a result has got grant funding and contract funding from the state as well as from trusts, and individuals still support that work. We have three activity areas: the lobbying and campaigning work, education and training, as well as clinical and support services for young people. But at the heart of all of those is a commitment to bringing about lasting change in the legal system, in terms of the rights that people have, and in terms of access to education, training and support. Now, we employ 660 staff, and we see 1,500 young people every day or have direct contact with through services and online and telephone services. We then have 2 people in our campaigning team. And if we were to actually say, where will we achieve the greatest change, it won't be from the 2 people in our campaigning team. It's got to be from the 660 people who are working day in, day out to demonstrate, to innovate and to provide the support to young people. And those people that come and work for us are committed to establishing high expectations for young people in relation to sexual health in order that they have high expectations for themselves. Now, we have taken money from the state, and at the same time we have also achieved the right for under 16 to have access to contraception, the right to have, for young people to have confidential services, the equal age of consent, and made all sorts of policy progress. Now, when I sit and listen to people, some people say you cannot be outspoken, loud and determined if you're taking money from the state, and I would say that's an absolute, it's absolute nonsense. You can do both of them. Of course you have to think about how you do it, and of course you have to be clear about how you do it, but if charities cannot find a way, if they're working with the state, to also make sure they represent their constituencies and their beneficiaries, however they need to do so, then I think that we have a problem. One of the questions we've asked recently in relation to the reduced envelope, which many of us are experiencing, is what are the most important things for us to do now? And then develop our strategy, our structure, our tactics, our fundraising to deliver that. And to my mind, it's my job as Chief Executive working with the trustees to make sure that we get that right. And we get that right, and if that means that we redirect resource to make sure that we're campaigning, because that's the most important thing to do, then that's what we need to do. But it doesn't mean severing ties completely. In terms of compact voice, I've renegotiated the compact agreement. If any of you don't know what it is, then I can tell you afterwards. But I've renegotiated it with the Labour government in 2009 and with the coalition government in 2010. It felt like a long lot of renegotiation. But as the rep for the sector, what really interested me it was the diversity of the sector that people kept on talking about, the diversity of the charity sector, and that was why we wouldn't be able to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And sometimes that diversity was underpinned by it. That means that we can't actually move forward in negotiating agreement, whereas my view is that there is a commonality and that we can negotiate an agreement so that everybody that works within the charity sector, whether you're one person who volunteers with no money from the state or a big organisation that gets 110 million, of which 55% is from the state, you still have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of our constituencies. So, finally, just to say that with the Emil Farry Foundation, which is the trust which helps young people to write, we have no connection with the state, £40,000 of income, and we're all volunteers that work with them. And whatever happens with the state now, in 3 years' time, in 10 years' time, it's unlikely that it will make any difference to the way that we try and bring about social benefit to the constituents. So, big can be beautiful. Big will often take money from the state. It can be really important, and there are some things big charities can do that small ones can't. Small can also be great, but neither size makes them automatically right or automatically wrong. The charity sector needs to maintain its innovative approach. It needs to maintain its focus on a sense of justice, and independence is vital. But we have to recognise that we are operating independently within the context of interdependence if we're actually going to bring about change. So there is no one way, and I think it's fair to say, in my opinion, it's the skill of the leaders and the people that are responsible for driving forward the work of those organisations that will be the indicator of success. I don't think a severing of ties in order to say that the only role of charities is to campaign would take us any way forward. I certainly actually think it would mean a regressive step.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
The charity sector isn't being very charitable at the moment. It is, after all, being asked to deliver the big society while itself being subject to the big cuts, as you've already heard. Stephen Brook, Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Executives of Voluntary Organisations, ASEVO, warns in an open letter to the Prime Minister of an approaching tidal wave of growing needs and rising cuts. This new programme for government, this renaissance for civil society, he says, without a hint of contradiction, is being starved of the funds it desperately needs. Stop ignoring us and give us the money we need for supporting the poor and vulnerable, demands Brook. Stuart Etherington, Chief Executive of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, NCVO, echoes his plea. We support the idea of a big society, but the government needs to take swift action now to ensure that voluntary organisations survive to deliver it. As a consequence of last year's £81 billion cuts announced in the Comprehensive Spending Review, local authorities need to save around £6.5 billion this year, and the charity sector is going to be nearly £3 billion worse off over the next 5 years. As Patrick Butler of The Guardian says, the cuts are not directed at charities as such, but at services which charities happen to provide. Typically, these include things like supported housing, women's refuges, family support, etc. It's the vulnerable beneficiaries, he says, who will suffer most as we lose a few £100 here, a few £1,000 there, the youth work made redundant here, the day centre's hours dramatically reduced there. All of these things do add up, and will in many cases have quite a devastating impact on the people who use these services, and on those who receive support from the charities affected. According to the National Association for Voluntary and Community Action, this will cause real damage to many communities, which is why we all have a duty to speak out to protect services for our most vulnerable citizens. You might have noticed by now that the word vulnerable keeps coming up, which is why we also have a duty, I think, to be more sceptical about some of the claims made on behalf of those vulnerable groups. There is, it seems, a degree of competitive claims making and faulting victimhood, as each charity seeks to out-patronise the other, as they in turn are patronised by the state. Is it really the case that our streets will fill with homeless drug users, or that there will be a surge in domestic abuse if certain charities lose their funding or close down, as has been claimed? Are some of them guilty of inflating problems that are less pressing than we might be led to believe, or inventing catastrophes should their funding be withdrawn? To what extent are they providing a useful service to people in desperate need, rather than hiding behind the vulnerable status of their supposed beneficiaries? A recent piece in The Guardian expresses shocked outrage that a charity helping men being abused by their partners should lose some of its funding. After all, they say, the British Crime Survey says that 1 in 6 men experience domestic violence. And who can argue with that? Which for me, I think, at least suggests that perhaps some services do need cutting. And the charities that provide them do neither state support, indeed life support, that is keeping it going. While in no way against charities providing public services, they no doubt do a better job in a lot of cases. We do need to ask ourselves what we mean by charity, when they so belittle those they claim to be working for in some instances, and when they effectively become an arm of the state. The programme of cuts that charities are so reeling against at the moment is nothing to be celebrated, but it does expose this much. As Patrick Butler puts it, what we are witnessing is the extended state, if you like, being decommissioned. Over a third of voluntary sector organisations receive state funding. That comes to around £12 billion a year. It's little wonder in this economic crisis and severe public spending constraints that they now find themselves in their own crisis. It's reported that 1,600 charities have gone out of business in the coalition's first year. Others have merged. Not only have charities lost much of their funding from the state, but private donations from members of the public are also on the decline. This no doubt reflects the fact that we all have less to give, but it also points, I think, to a failing legitimacy for the sector. It seems to have lost its way, and as a consequence sought out the wealth of corporate donor and the tax break, rather than go to the trouble of making the case for the cause, whatever that might be, to the general public. Stephen Bubb argues that the sector can and should provide services while retaining its independent voice, something that Simon echoes. He gave a talk last year explaining how prior to the Reformation, the concept of an independent charity sector was unknown because the affairs of the charity and state were intimately entwined. It was late 18th and 19th centuries that brought the campaigning charity against cruelty to animals, for instance, and only then, bizarrely, cruelty to children. Of course, as he suggests, charities like Shelter and the NSPCC continue to provide services and to campaign too. But this dual role is deeply problematic because it confuses what charities are for, undermining any claim to a truly independent voice, while endorsing them as somehow representative. But, like many in the sector, want it both ways. The charities that work for the state and at the same time campaign against it are inevitably compromised. The charity sector does not represent us. Shelter, for all its good work, does not represent the homeless. And the NSPCC is far from representing abused children, still less the adult population for whom it has a very little view. Indeed, finally, one might ask, who does the charity sector represent other than itself? And why should we stand up for it when the money runs out?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The charity sector in this country originally grew out of the Catholic Church, and for several centuries the Church has a monopoly on charity, as it is healthcare and education. And obviously, during this time, the Church did great work helping the vulnerable now from. But they did this for the glory of the Church, and to be part of this sector, as we've put out, one had to be a believer, at least pretend to believe. The Reformation liberalised this in a sense. It allowed sort of diverse groups to eventually start to be involved in charity. And in the 19th century saw this great explosion of British charity. Philanthropy in this country is probably more than empire building or the great engineering works, the great achievement of Victorian Britain. But I should say, something that sets out my story, I fear that we've sort of, in a way, come full circle now. And in a sense, the state has almost taken on the role of the church, and I think this is quite a sort of dangerous, ultimately, idea. I mean, if you look at the amount of money that goes from the state towards these charities, it's quite astounding. Oxfam receives £40 million a year, the RSPB £20 million a year, Christine Aid 11. These are 2009 figures that they're out today. The World Wildlife Fund almost 5 million. 25,000 British charities get more than 3/4 of their funding from the government. And then there are all sorts of campaigning charities, which is Our Action Smoking Health. They get almost 200,000. And then
some charities, according to one CITSAT report, Save the Children, Oxfam Shelter and the Red Cross were between 30 and 70% state funded, so Donados was 78% state funding. I mean, in a sense, you might ask, why should this matter if they're doing good work? Well, I mean, according to the Institute of Fundraising, it says a registered charity is not permitted to have political objectives or undertake political lobbying other than in a generally educational sense. But, I mean, as people told me, the charity said that's nonsense, really. And apart from the fact that the Charity Commission can't deal with, what is it, 190,000 charities. No charity can be apolitical. If you're dealing with trafficked women or, homeless children or, lung cancer, for instance, you're not going to not become interested in the cause of those things, and you should try to stop them. You can't expect a human to do that. And so what we have is Oxfam, which is a 320 million income a year. It says it spends 8% on lobbying for the right to be heard, raising people's awareness of their rights and helping them lobby their government and other decision makers. That means that's about £20 million worth of campaigning. Christian Aid, likewise, one of the big charities, which does great work, but it also does huge amounts of lobbying. One of their campaign managers described their role as fighting the forces of neoliberalism. I don't think you can claim that wasn't political. Certain charities, ASH again, which is a bit of a bugbear for people, certainly did have a role in changing the law as far as smoking is concerned. They brought out these surveys that showed that people were against smoking when they asked the question in a particular way. Then you had the scene at Glen Eagles a few years ago where the major charities were organising, campaigning and funding a protest march in favour of British government policy while the British government was meeting other governments. And you also had the 5 of the biggest charities were campaigning for the Robin Hood tax, where whether you believe that's right or not, it's strange where the taxpayers are funding groups to lobby the taxpayers for more funding themselves. And you might think, well, that's a bit odd. And even stranger is that these taxpayer groups often appear on taxpayer-funded radio and are presented as disinterested parties, which is a sort of very false from the right, I find particularly mad, you can count countless ones. There's a recent campaign about Mind, again, they do great work. They were campaigning against government changes to the definition of mental illness and towards mentally ill people. And no one mentioned that Mind, which is 40% funded by the state, they were campaigning against changes in law that would reduce the size of their constituency. You might argue they're right, but there should be sort of more honesty about it. And in terms of things like another group that regularly raised before was at the Family and Parenting Institute, who campaigned, lobbied against government changes that would favour tax breaks for married couples, and then 85% of the taxpayer funded, and it's never presented as in an honest way. And because that's someone from a charity, it's someone from gravitas, and someone from government, or someone from some other thing, because they've got this moral thing. And so what you have really is asymmetrical debate, because the government, the taxpayers, funding one side of any debate. And I found so far 12 charities that campaign for, in terms of immigration, for more immigration. There isn't a single one across the line that, I don't know how you can say a charity that opposes immigration. And all of this, I think, has corrupting influence. There's nowhere in the world where the state doesn't subsidise something becomes more favourable to the state. We look at the French press, which is sort of overlooked all sorts of corruption down the years. And Nick Cohen's reported how the National Association for Care and Resettlement Offenders, which was one of the great critics of government policy, has now become completely silent. Guido Fawkes, who said something suitably offensive once, he said, a charity that relies in the main part of taxes is no more a charity than a prostitute to a girlfriend. I can see what he's getting at, or in this way. Charity is a gift, not just to an individual or group. It's an investment in the collective pool of social capital and trust in society. When it no longer becomes voluntary, it ends up having the opposite effect. It's cynicism in the public, and when combined with well-publicised high wages, those at the top, and the active political campaigning, people become less. The social capital goes down as a result. And to come back to the original point, I would argue that where once charities were dominated by Christianity and Catholicism, and where they always campaign, ultimately, not just for doing well, but doing good, but also for their religion. Now, charities become part of the state, and the state is almost taking the role of the church. And what we have is statism, so that the only answer to all things is more statism, there is more government involvement. And I think ultimately that's a sort of very liberal trend.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting point that Ed's raised, and I guess I'd like to sort of extend it in a sense and ask the other two speakers to say what they think. But there seems to be a possibility that charities could be called very anti-democratic in the way that unelected people get to get privileged access, in a sense, to government and influence policy through that privileged access. You could also argue, potentially, that actually the sign of a dynamic democracy, a good democracy, is the fact that there are lots of charities campaigning. And I think it's kind of going along with some of what Ed was asking, or making the point about. It'd be interesting to hear what you sign. What's your
I think we have to blow the myth out of the water that a charity automatically gets a right or a privilege in influencing policy. There are a number of charities who never get to sit around a table and have policy discussions, or never have direct access, and for some that's a source of frustration, and for others they think that that's absolutely right. But to say if we become a charity, you automatically are there influencing policy is a nonsense. I actually do think that it's a sign of a grown-up democracy, that you can both have money from the state and also to campaign. I don't think the state has entirely separate objectives from charity at all times. Sometimes there will be separate objectives, but actually part of the process of being a charity is to achieve something, and at that point should be closing down. And if a charity is set up without wanting to influence and to make things better, good, or to move in the right direction, it seems to me slightly peculiar thought. So, Dave's point around, is it a conflict, both campaign and to be a service provider? If I have the wealth of information at my fingertips from seeing 300,000 young people each year, and I was not willing to use that to share and to influence social change and policy for the benefit of individuals and society, then I would see that as being a much more conflicted position.
As I said, I think charities can both provide services and they can campaign. The difficulty is that the one undermines the other, in my view, if it's the same organisation doing it in both cases. I think the interesting thing is that both critics of the charity sector and those in the sector, such as Stephen Buck, they all say charity shouldn't be political. There is a real defensiveness about that. I think charities should be political. I think there's every reason why they should campaign, and I disagree with that on that. I think that's the essence of charities, is that sense of voluntarism, trying to organise around an issue of some sort and to further your cause. The difficulty now is that charities it's not that they don't do it, they do it less, and that the service providing aspects of what they do has become dominant. I think if charities do take on that role, if they do effectively become an arm of the state, then they should be subject to the same sorts of criticisms and searching questions that there's any other agency of the state. And I think that on this anti-democratic thing, I think that the difficulty of when charities do take on this role is that they do effectively crowd out genuine voluntarism, and they do tend to take on a dominant role in popular debates about child protection, domestic abuse, and many others. And they reinforce orthodoxy. And I don't think that they have any right to do that. I think that they don't represent anybody other than themselves.
Right, up to you. Yes, right at that. I'm going to take 3 questions and then ask the speakers to comment.
Okay. I've had 30 years experience experience of working in charities, and there was a volunteer and a paid worker. And my sort of 30 years have been paralleled with political activity as well. And I think there's been plenty of people who have been fellow travellers with me. And what I've witnessed is that what we try to do is support people in terms of social problems. Where there were gaps and where the state failed, we try to help people. And the map in that 30 years is completely altered with the funding that people receive from the state. And this is large and small charities that I'm thinking of, but also the expansion of the charities sector. And I think it's disingenuous to think that there hasn't been compromises made, because often you'll have annual meetings, general annual meetings, that will replicate the language of the state in terms of what people have done and what they're about to do. So there's such a parallel sort of process there that it's hard for me to say that there's a sort of uncritical process going on. People have really conformed to the needs of the state. And the state at the same time has been parasitical because of the collapse of politics, because of the collapse of the left, and that battle, that class battle that was raging. Charities have just been able to almost organically expand in this area. And I think it sort of goes against what something is, which is very sort of historically specific that's happening to people like me and a generation of people who have seen that change. And when we try to think about a future for charities, it's hard because I think it relies on political activism again to make that difference. Because charities generally are so absorbed now, and I don't think they represent particular constituencies anymore. They make particular issues, they're gesture politics, but they don't have what used to be a broader coalition of people anymore. It's too fragmented and too atomised and very undemocratic.
Thank you. Yes.
Cheers. Dave, you said that charities belittle people, but hasn't this always been the case with certain charities, or a lot of charities, in the sense that a lot of them arise in the 19th century as almost kind of domestic missionary work prior to the empire existing, going into save the lower orders from themselves? And doesn't this kind of encourage people to act accordingly as well to get the charity? Doesn't it create a kind of charity recipient cap in hand?
Just at the front here.
I have to run an education charity. I also campaign with a separate education campaign organisation, and it's me doing both things. And obviously my motivation that drives one activity is also the same motivation that drives the other. And I've always felt that these things should be quite separate. Now, I was interested in Dave's starting point, which is what do we mean by charity? And this is something I've often asked myself. And I said to myself that let's just suppose you find a man, he's in the gutter, he might be ill, he might be wrong, he might be injured. Now, if you simply go up to that person and you help them, get them out of the gutter, you see what they need, you follow up, you perhaps do call the ambulance, you stay with them, you comfort them, that's an act of charity. If you move the person out of the gutter because they're in the way, maybe you do something else as well, I don't know, maybe with the ambulance, that is probably of public benefit. Now, I'm very concerned, which takes me to this point, and I was very concerned when the Charity Commission introduced this factor of public benefit, this criteria of public benefit, in order to define whether you were or you were not a charity. And I feel that is false. It's a very unfortunate thing to do because it allies charities with a sort of activity which governments either do carry out or should carry out or wish to carry out. It provides a way in to becoming, if you like, another arm of government and therefore being able to make a case for receiving public funding. Now, my charity has, in fact, received public funding, but we've always been very careful to ensure that if we have that public funding, it serves our charitable objectives, and that we don't serve the objectives of government by accepting that funding. If there's some cross-referencing here, that's fine, it's to our benefit, and it's to the benefit of our beneficiaries. But I think we do actually have to be very clear about this, and I do actually think campaigning is a quite separate activity. I think it's extremely important in a democracy that you should have a campaign, and why you have to be a charity in order to do the campaign.
I've just escaped from the public sector to work for a charity and discovered that I've exchanged one thing for something very, very similar. And as part of my induction, I went to a fundraising conference recently. And I discovered there, what the woman in front of me just talked about, saying that charities have to have public benefit. And one case study that was presented was British Waterways. They're setting up and they're going to start getting money from donors. And everything about their campaign was that it would be environmentally friendly, would have health benefits, there'd be public involvement, blah blah blah. It was just like being back at work in the home service. But the other thing that I'm discovering is that it seems like that everybody will actively will do anything to involve having a discussion with donors to persuade them if people are kind of faltering or not sure or say they don't have the money or whatever. They don't actually get into a discussion to persuade them that it would be worth their while to support this or that organisation. And the notion that charity begins at home seems to be something that is acceptable now. So, you know, if you were fundraising for something in Africa and somebody thinks, well, that's a waste of money because it's a waste of money to go to Africa and shouldn't you be doing something at home? It's great if you have something in your badge and you pull out and say, well, you can fundraise for stuff at home as well. And I would think that that is precisely the opposite of what we should be doing because, okay, the Bank of Ideas isn't a charity, but I've worked as a volunteer for the Bank of Ideas for a long, long time because I'm convinced that what it does is a good thing. And it's that kind of continual challenge that makes it worthwhile, I think. And if we don't engage in those kind of difficult political discussions, then we're going to not engage people in a way that I think could have a better effect than what's happening currently.
Thank you. I do think, I mean, there is an interesting point somebody raised about political activism and charitable work. I'm not convinced that political activism and charitable campaigning are the same in any sense at all. I think there's a real fundamental difference between what we call voluntarism and political activity. And I think it would be wrong to think that, you know, charities are somehow doing that, even though they may be political, as Ed said, you know, there may be a political element to charitable work. I don't think political activism and voluntarism are the same thing. That might be controversial. Anyway, would you like to, let's start with you, Ed, you can speak for a while. Let's come back on any of the points, all of the points.
Well, I was thinking in some way it was partly to do with Margaret Thatcher's trying to, a lot of this should be making charitable sectors basically sort of rivals the public sector, so they get involved in more things, and that's why they become sort of alternative public sector, and obviously the charities it's like that, because you know, everyone knows so much. But I do think it's sort of, you know, it's impossible to, charities shouldn't be necessarily political, it's impossible to separate. I didn't say, by the way, that they shouldn't be political. I was saying it's impossible for them not to be political, because politics and charity are basically, in many ways, similar things. We're trying to make the world a better place. You know, politics are getting the roots of the things, and charity are doing the immediate causes. It's just like, you know, saying that there's paid for that politics. It's impossible thing. I mean, I'll come back to what you made about charities that once their work is done, sort of wind up. I mean, I've never heard of a single charity or campaign group that's ever done this Cincinnatus thing. Yes, my work is done now, we're going to wind up. I mean, I would love to give an award, of course, you know, something, but I don't think it really happens.
It doesn't happen often enough. But anyway, we can have that conversation.
Simon, did you
Let's just be clear here that what we're not allowed to do as a charity is be party political. There is a distinction between being political in your activity and taking political activity to influence things than being party political. So we just need to be clear about that. I also think, I don't think that I said, and I suspect you're talking to me, that compromises haven't been made. I think that they have been made, and sometimes those are good compromises and sometimes they are not. What I was saying is it's the leadership within the charity that has to hold the course and to be able to deliver. As this lady at the front is saying, is responsible for deciding whether taking this money is to achieve your mission and your goals for the benefit of the people that you believe you will have some benefit. It's not, and that's where some of the problems is. And people often talk about mission drift and people chasing the money. Well, frankly, that's not what charities should be doing. If they're doing it, then and they are doing it. Then we would argue that some do, but that isn't. They're not forced to do that. They do have decisions to make. And each time you are with the trustees, they should be asking, what should we be doing? Reviewing the strategy, their purpose, and all of those things. And I just think it's really dangerous here to work into generalisations. If you go into any individual charity, if you went into 5 charities next week, there will be some that do some bits of things well and some things people do some bits and others. But say all charities belittle is wrong. To say that some charities drum up a catastrophe, sometimes they do. But actually, increasingly, as people participate, you would hope that it's not belittling because you're actually working with the people that you're trying to help. And Brook is a classic example where 10 years ago young people were not as involved in the way that campaigns shaped, what the priorities were, how they were delivered, what the messages were, how they wanted those messages to be conveyed. Now they are. Now, if that means that when they're received by people, we had a campaign 2 weeks ago around sex and relationships education, which launched, which was based on what 2,000 young people had said, which was then shaped by a group of young people about how they wanted those messages to be shaped. Was it perfect? No. Did it belittle young people? No. Did it set out a problem? Yes. It may not be a problem that everybody agrees with. And so I guess I'm slightly confused here in that we have social enterprises, we have the private sector, we have the public sector, we have the charity sector, we have community groups, volunteer groups. And what we seem to be saying is that all charities have lost their way. Now, I for one, I do not believe that is true. And I think that if we were to sit and try and force all charities to do one thing or the other, I think that would be a real mistake.
I think it's true. Charity and politics are 2 different types of activity. Somebody at the back mentioned the collapse of politics. I think that has something to do with what's going on in the world of charity as well. In a number of ways, they face some of the problems. Alienation, I'd say, from their own family principles, what they're about. Political parties that are going through the same problems. And also their alienation from their supporters, their potential donors, the general public. Political party membership is falling, and charities are struggling to get people to give them the money they need, which is why they tend to have problems in persuading people, as British said, to actually donate to them and support them and volunteer for them. So there's an obsession with gimmicks about how you get hold of the money. And there's a tendency to cozy up more and more to both the states and to big corporates. The question about am I perhaps underestimating what would be the kind of missionary side of charities and how the influence that has over what we mean by charity and notions of charity. Interestingly enough, or ironically I suppose, what we lack today is a mission. I think the charity sector does lack a mission, but at least the missionaries have one by definition. Their kind of notion of moral reform wouldn't be something that any of us in this room would support now. But I think charities reflect the ideas of the parents at the time. I think that obviously those reformers will be reacting to the industrialisation and to the growing influence of the working class, and that led to welfare states. There was a very cosy relationship then between the states and those reformers, and that is a problem, I agree. But at the same time, I do recognise it in the real world that there is a need for compromise, there is a need for pragmatism, and charities will have these battles over whose agenda wins out. The problem is that all those agendas too often seem to fit quite nicely. So the NSPCC reflects government policy on child protection and vice versa. They become one and the same, and that is a problem because it does crowd out any dissenting voices. I think that's something we should take seriously.
Okay, give rise to more comments, hopefully. Yes, over there.
I was just wanting to ask to what extent you feel like charities have actually become estranged from the communities they're supposed to be helping, and in a certain sense they further alienate the communities. I'm thinking in a lot of the initiatives that they came through, like a few years ago, they were, a lot of charities were doing things around anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia type thing. And now they do stuff around healthy eating, safe sex, raising awareness of mental health issues, smoking. Now these weren't organic needs that were identified by communities. These were top down, coming from government and middle class professionals. So they were on the go. So in that sense, I could see that communities feel alienated from some of these charities. And then the NSPCC get mentioned there, and I like the point about competitive claims making. Because when I look at it, I think a lot of the time, some of the charities have such a dim view of people. The NSPCC, we're all child abusers, mine, we're all mentally ill. Platform 51, goes by WCA, 60% of women are mentally ill and require their professional help, one of their recent reports. And more they're telling us that we're these debased communities, debased individuals. I think, well, how on earth are we going to come together as a community? Because we're all just abusing each other, aren't we?
Also someone who's worked in the voluntary sector for 25 years or more. I just think that with or without funding, there's been a shift so that in the early days, 25 years ago, I think people, especially in the small voluntary sector in which I worked, would see that they were doing politics. They were doing politics by doing work in these organisations. And I think that's really what's changed, because whether you got money from the Greater London Council, where you could actually pursue all these, whether it was anti-racist work or whatever it was. Now, with the professionalisation of the charity sector, with, in a way, even independent funders giving money for what are essentially government priorities, in a way, there's no way of doing your scholars or political work. And I say that coming from the sector which work with refugee and migrants, where initially it was immigration advice to make sure that people have the right to stay in the country, and then suddenly it was fluffy issues around integration and integration until you eventually land up just pursuing government priorities. And the question of whether the communities are alienated, I always wonder, with all the cuts, why is it that we can't get our beneficiaries, our users, out to protest? Well, actually, it's because we're doing things, just on behalf of people, and there's not any kind of democratic there's not a group of people that can get out and mobilise anymore. We actually, maybe 20 years ago, we did. We got your users out on the streets.
Are you suggesting there's not really a public demand for some of the campaigns? You mean amongst the actual top of the march? That there's no sort of mass protests about cuts in...
I mean, I was also meeting last night where a very high-profile immigration officer said, oh, we don't need churches anymore, what we need is real challenges. It's almost like we don't need...
Right. I mean, that kind of ties into what he says about sort of disconnected from sort of popular opinion. I mean, once charities were sort of set up after this national outrages against the treatment of children or animals, animals in the process. But now, they say it's sort of part of sort of government strategies to reduce sort of, sexual health problems or so. One thing I should point out is that no one really says that in the United States, and sort of more people do actually, not saying do give far more to charity. And so there are tax breaks, and I mean, and that is probably something we should start looking at, but I don't think having a bigger stake must be nicer or generous.
Okay, can we have a few more questions from the floor? Yes. And then I'll talk again.
Not so much a question, but a kind of an observation and statement. I've been a trustee and volunteer for two organisations for quite a long time. One organisation is receipt of public money, and one organisation is totally independent and private. And so a big difference in how as trustees we operate as leadership. Because in the private charity, we're able to really infuse volunteers, and people can stay really close to the original cause and the charitable ways of the organisation. And it's a lot easier to actually bring people with you and have them stay with you for a long time and give their support and give their energies. The organisation that we've got to receive public money, I'll be honest with you, we have to be very strong on the board to really defend off the government's changing directors. But the language that's used with us as trustees, and as we speak, it's really, professionalisation is fine, and all in favour of that, but it's the constant shifting of the gatepost and trying to serve different stakeholder groups that they perceive to be important to our objectives, and therefore content to let us leave behind the beneficiaries. One of the organisations I'm talking about is around the eradication of racism in sport. Now, the whole kind of idea that racism in sport has disappeared off the radar is absolutely not true. You wouldn't believe what government is doing. And the gentleman back is absolutely right. There's much more function around, the message that's coming from the government, from DCMS, is around making sure that our campaigns around healthy living, or physical activity, and that's about dealing with the core issue of the disempowerment of individuals who right to participate in sport at all levels. So I do feel that charities are under tremendous pressure from who they're funding, who the funders are, and the only advice I give to anybody in the room is to have a really diverse portfolio of funding, so you actually are not talking to one paymaster, and you can be true to yourself. Thank you.
Hi, observations really, comments, and also perhaps to address something that the chair said a little earlier. I've been involved in the charity sector since pretty much when I left school in one way or another. And I've been involved in setting up charities from scratch with local communities in many parts of the country. I've sat on established charities, I've troubleshot in the charity sector, and I've seen how, as I've heard other people here say, how the scene, the scenario, the landscape has changed so much over that time. And I would address the comment you made about the fact that political activism and volunteering are not the same thing. If you're not paid to do a task, you're a volunteer, for whatever purpose it is. So you can't delineate the two. I don't know if you would align political activism with chucking bricks through windows. That's not what I would address as, that's not my list. However, the charities sector was set up in the days when we had the poor law. That's, before that. And we now, in a scenario where the charity sector is having to respond to a very different government from the one that most of us have grown up to expect. So therefore, the charity sector is effectively on the back foot in a different way and having to realign itself, or as they realign itself, some parts of the charity sector will obviously be inculcated into the government-big society one way or another, if such a thing can actually be quantified, because as yet it hasn't been.
So in order to get funding, you've got to do X, Y, and Z and tick the boxes. Meanwhile, other things that we all sort of perhaps almost took for granted as part of our roles and our responsibilities. I've also worked in the public sector as well, so I'm not just talking with a charity hat on, but those things are being undermined and challenged and changed before our eyes, eviscerated, whatever. So therefore, I'm now in a situation where I've had to set up a campaigning organisation, which is only very small and local, but we've got a lot of sort of notice in the sort of national side, which has got a political element to it, because we are countering the attack on the NHS, which is something I thought I'd never have to do. And so every day of the week, I'm looking at the wretched health and social care bill, and we petitioned, and this is something I never ever thought I would have to do. But what we're having to do, some people in the charity sector are having to set up extra elements of what we do. And this is quite separate. This is not part of another charity. This is just a group that's via a political party, but now we incorporate other people who are not part of that political party. We care about the NHS. So you could say that's political activism, but we're volunteers, we're not paid for it, and I'm having to fundraise in order to campaign something that we all, I think, in this room would expect to be a fundamental right. So the charity sector is having to change in the face of a changing government. So I couldn't agree with you that political activism is not the same as volunteering. Having also worked with children and families charities upright and left, right, etc.
Thank you.
What sort of a role do you think charities should be playing in terms of what sort of services, what level do you think in terms of regulation?
Thank you. Any last points? Right at the back.
I just think that the problem with taking money from the problem with taking money from the state when you're a charity is that you're working for the people that are creating the problem in the first place sometimes. And I don't think that the people that are necessarily doing the charity work is that's their aim, but I think that's what happens. And sometimes I think that you have to look into your principles rather than always having to be pragmatic with it.
Yes, we've been talking for good reason about we've been talking for good reason about how possibly charitable objectives can either be aided or, if you like, subverted by receiving public funding. But what is also increasingly common and growing today is another form of charitable support, which is coming mostly from capitalists. And we have something called philanthropism, venture philanthropy, which I suppose is the same thing, where there is this, basically, the obsession in this area is that the charity must develop, it must replicate what it does. There are obviously outputs, as directed state funding, outputs that must be demonstrated, and so on. So this, basically, we always have a problem with charities of the possibility of fee-based type of thing. And it doesn't really matter who the funder is. Funders need to be gratified, their objectives need to be fulfilled, and if you're a charity, you have to be very strong
have to ask the speakers for 1 minute summation or responding to something, but just 1 minute to end, because otherwise we're going to be in this room when the next session starts.
Stop brilliantly. In response to your question, I believe people will always fall for the cracks of states and state funds everything, and so the whole charity system sort of mop. And unfortunately, there are always people who are falling through those cracks. But I don't think the state can do everything. There'll always be alcoholics, there'll always be abused children. And that's where the charities do that. In response to the lady in the back, I do agree. I do think that sometimes charities end up campaigning and doing the government's jobs, campaigning for laws that often make situations worse. I don't think that's cynicism. I just think that's the sort of law of unintended consequences. I think, for example, at Platform 51 campaigned for the Equality Act. They also campaigned for more funding towards sort of low mothers, and that's the classic example of something that's obviously very good at short term. You help someone in the long term, you might actually be creating more of those situations. So that would be my summing up. Just because that's the
Thank you.
I think the discussion of the big society has been very revealing, I think, in relation to charities. There's an assumption that it's all about them. The civil society sector, as they sometimes call themselves, working with the state. Whereas I always thought the big society was about freeing people up, about the community, about individuals doing things themselves. It's kind of being sewn up, by the state and the third sector. I think charities actually should embody voluntarism. They should embody that notion that people can do things for themselves and they can, off their own back, pursue whatever it is they want to pursue. I don't necessarily think that official, vetted volunteering is what that's about. Again, volunteering has become something quite state-sponsored rather than voluntaristic. So, what's actually happened though is that charities become based on something that was already said. They can diminish view of what people are capable of. They're vulnerable, they're damaged. And big societies are going to happen. Societies that damage people. So I think we perhaps need to get past that view of what people are capable of first, and then build commercial charity and volunteering around that.
I just want to go back to the point that I made before, which is that the trustees and the leaders are always the decision makers. If anyone says to you, I had to do it because the funds are made me, then they shouldn't be in that role. And I feel really, really strongly about that. And I hear and listen to what we've had today with interest and some bits with sadness about some of the generalisations. And I think that there is a real final point from you, which is that the charity sector, as I understand it, does include exactly what you said, which is brilliant work, people getting angry about something, standing up. It includes some people who deliver big services, and if it's disconnected from their beneficiaries, then there's a whole lot of work that they need to do, and they should be held to account for it by beneficiaries and working with them. And you'll get that, but are we alienating them? We have to turn some of that on its head, and look about what its purpose is. But trustees are decision makers, and your decision, and leaders, and your decision to take funding is your decision. It is not government's decision. It's not Shell's decision. It's not Sainsbury's Trust decision, and you have to be accountable how you spend that for benefit beneficiaries.
Thank you.